And to hear Elvis talk about that night, part of the dynamic for him, too, was how Bill Black slapped the bass. He called it a double lick. He described it as almost being like jungle drums. And so if you imagine that sort of vibe at this Hillbilly Hoedown show, it was completely radical.
I'm one of the best investigative reporters, I think, in the world today.
So the Overton Park Show, as you know, is a nonprofit, and we are a concert promoter. We put on 50 free shows a year.
Wow.
We also do a lot of other community building things like goat yoga and Zumba and things like that. The brand new mobile shell, which essentially allows a half-size version of the shell pulled behind an 18-wheeler to pull up into an underserved neighborhood and take our mission to places that might not necessarily have access to the shell or have ever even heard of it even.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
But I'm excited the most about, I love the music, of course, and seeing people come together through the power of music, but the new museum we have in the backstage areas of the Overton Park Shell is really been a kick, and people are really enjoying it. There's so much history there, of course, much more than Elvis's first professional show. There's all kinds of other great, cool history, and the show really ties it all together.
And I was just so impressed with this museum. I had no idea that was there and that you could go inside that part of the show. It was very interesting. It's broken down into 3 sections, the tour. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, again, we're first and foremost, we're a working concert venue based on the space of the historical building. We split it up. When we have buses, we split it up. And basically, it's all chronological, the flow of it. That's just the way we figured out how to organize the story, so to speak. We're able to really focus more on the Elvis story because there's so much more. You know, Elvis kept coming back to the shell. It was a very important place for him in his life and his family's life. You know, Lisa Marie played there in 2013, etc. Hoping to have Riley play there someday. Any other generations of Presley we're super excited about. And now that we have an indoor museum, we're open year round, and we're super excited about starting to partner with Graceland and Elvis fans from all around the world to actually have events during those times.
Oh my goodness, that would be great. What kind of events are you looking at doing there?
Well, we've got some great ideas. I don't want to spoil the surprise. I'll just say that we're going to recreate some of the Elvis magic there, and I'll just leave it there.
Oh my gosh. Well, and for people that maybe are traveling to Memphis to see some of the Elvis things, or just in Memphis and interested in some of the local tourism, music history, all that great stuff. If somebody wanted to come and take a tour, how would they go about that?
Well, the easiest is through the website, www.overtonparkshell.org. And then /tours is the quickest way to find it. But if you go to our website in general, it's under programs, because again, we're not the only thing, we have concerts and all kinds of different community activities. So, or people can call me, I'm 901-482-1695.
And tell us a little bit more about you and your role with the museum.
Well, we're a nonprofit, like I said, and so my job is normally we mentor college students to learn how to shoot multi-camera concerts for the big screens for the concerts.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
So, I've always been a music fan, and I was a history major in college, and so had a small career in the interpretive planning part of museum world for history museums. So when we came upon our 85th anniversary of the show, found a couple of pieces on eBay that started the whole thing, and so we built it from scratch and said it's chronological. But it covers so many different types of history, not only music, but political, art, civil rights struggles, everywhere from Black Sabbath to Al Capone. The history is still being made, and that's why I love it when groups like you show up and people share their Elvis stories. That just really makes the whole thing just so special and so creative and so fun as a job.
For people who have not had the pleasure of visiting the museum yet, this is a really well done tour. It's very comprehensive. The fact that it's broken down into 3 parts, you get a lot of Memphis history, you get a lot of music history. And although I knew, of course, that the Shell is a very iconic venue, I was shocked. There's a part of this tour where you go into this back room And it's so cool. Like, it's got all the music posters and all the pictures of the people that have played there through the years. It's like all of a sudden, it's almost like in The Wizard of Oz when she steps out into the Technicolor part, because this room is just fantastic. And I was so impressed with the number of iconic performers that had performed at the show through the years. Tell us some of the other people.
Well, Willie Mitchell played there in 1969. Really once civil rights and an important civil rights action actually happened in the Shell at 1960, which led to all public facilities in Memphis being desegregated. And to me, the history really takes off. They started having the folk festivals there. They started having the country blues festivals. Early classic rock bands, Deep Purple, Mountain, James Gang, bands like that, Black Oak, Arkansas. The whole history of the show also, as well as a bunch of historic preservation ups and downs. And so it's an uplifting success story that way that we're super excited about telling the history. Literally, that thing came very close to becoming a parking lot several different times. And because of Elvis Presley and Elvis Presley's connection to the Shell, it was so much of an easier sell to get the community behind saving it when the powers that be weren't listening much. Really, it's a great success story, like I said, of people coming together and saving things that are worth saving. And, they would say things like, they would show up to city council and say things like, what would have Elvis wanted? And to me, that was such a great testament to his power, basically.
And the power of the fan base, I think, too. And of course, just as a reminder for people, Elvis on July 30th, 1954, played what is often considered the first rock and roll concert ever, opening for Slim Whitman, I believe. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
He was a late addition to the bill. They couldn't even get his name right in the advertising. They called him Elvis Presley. Super nervous. There was probably 5,000 people in front of him. He stood out. This was a hillbilly hoedown. Elvis was wearing very fashionable clothes, dark pink pants, for instance, which was pretty cool in the country world at that point anyway. And he sang a masterpiece of a song, That's All Right Mama, by Arthur Big Boy Crudup, which is basically rock and roll in and of itself. The original is a record if you hadn't heard it. Of course, Elvis's signature is on his version of it and another masterpiece. But he came out in that song. Sam Phillips had the formula, and he knew it. And it was a movie star looking guy singing a masterpiece of a song with a great voice, a great stage presence. And then when you catch the tour, there are other variables that really sort of amplified the dynamic of it in general. But it was so radical and revolutionary that people just screamed. First of all, Beatlemania type screaming had never really happened at a country show before necessarily. But this was such a radical event, combination of all these things, mostly having to do with Elvis's brilliance, that it just blew people away. And to hear Elvis talk about that night, part of the dynamic for him too was how Bill Black slapped the bass. He called it a double lick. He described it as almost being like jungle drums. And so if you imagine that sort of vibe at this hillbilly hoedown show, it was completely radical for the time and for history. And that night, a local DJ on a Memphis radio station said a star had been born at the show, and he was correct as well. And and if you come for the tour, of course, you'll learn about all the other times Elvis came back to the show. Again, it meant a lot to him. So we're super excited to have that legacy.
Absolutely. And for Elvis fans, I highly recommend doing this tour. Obviously, there's a very strong Elvis connection here, a very significant moment in both music and Elvis history that occurred here. But Elvis is very well represented in the tour. I don't want to spoil any surprises, but I will say that one thing that really struck me is the final room that you go into this tour has a very poignant Presley reference, the way it's set up. It's very, very well done. The Elvis aspect. There was another person I wanted to ask you about, and this was who I'd originally contacted you about, the singer. When I was doing the tour, you had mentioned a particular musician who, I'm going to be honest, I was not familiar with. I'd never heard of before. But the story that you told about him was so interesting that I kind of fell down a rabbit hole, and I've been trying to find out everything I can about them. So tell us a little bit about this guy. I think his story is so interesting.
Well, I was going through the records, and as a kid of the late 60s and 70s, classic rock was kind of my worldview. Although I will say, growing up, our housekeeper, Memphis has had the first black radio station in America. And our housekeeper used to listen to it, WDIA, all the time. So I won't say that my worldview is simply classic rock of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin, etc. I also had this other Stax, Motown, gospel affinity, and basically just because I heard it a lot, I associate it with being real music. So in this performers list from that classic rock era, I saw a show, and I'm pretty sure it was Mountain. I'm pretty sure it was 1970. It could have been 71, but it was a Mountain, and they had just done Mississippi Queen, which had been dreamy for me to hear back then. But anyway, I was just a kid. But this guy who warmed up was named Mylon, and I was like, Mylon. I was like, that's interesting. Like nylon, I didn't know, I'd never seen that name before, and so I just and Mylon LeFevre, French name, as a 17-year-old, his white gospel. Well, first of all, Mylon was the first rock and roller to sing about Jesus in really heavy, like Black Sabbath heavy rock and roll, which is fascinating to me right there. But anyway, but he was playing at the Shell in 70 or 71. But several years earlier, as a teenager, he was in his family's the LeFevres. In 1968, Elvis went and saw the LeFevres when they played in Memphis. And a song that Mylon had written ended up, Elvis really liked it and bought the rights from him. And that was the anchor for Elvis's 1968 gospel record. And so I was like, wow, okay. Well, come to find out, this Mylon guy ends up recording, I think, with The Who and Traffic, Alvin Lee, I think, and was on this meteoric rise and then wiped out on drugs and alcohol and pretty much gave up the heavy rock. And his band ended up becoming the Atlanta Rhythm Section, which was another band that I grew up with. And so I was completely fascinated by Mylon and so wish that I could have heard his connection with Elvis. But bottom line, obviously, he had an impact on Elvis. Elvis, liked that song that he had written as a 17-year-old. And at 17, having Elvis's money, I remember also reading about Mylon buying fast cars and things like that as a teenager, which was, pretty exciting, I'm sure, for a teenager to all of a sudden come into money like that. His Wikipedia page is sure fascinating.
Really, really just interesting guy, interesting career. I was interested to read that he had hitchhiked to that place where Elvis saw him perform. He was 17, like you were saying, and in military school in California, and made his way to Memphis. And that really paid off for him, obviously, because Elvis was in a booth with his then fiancée Priscilla, and they heard the song. And so Elvis asked for an introduction, ended up. And I read somewhere that, like, after it was on the How Great Thou Art album, by the end of that year, 100 people had done covers of this song called Without Him. And so, yeah, it paid off big time. I think he made around $900,000 for that song. So just a crazy story. I mean, such a stroke of fate, and being considered, really, it sounds like a pioneer as being one of the first, I guess what we would call Christian rock singers, although with a very, very hard edge. And I did learn also that he passed away in September of last year of 2023. So that was very sad to learn. Now, you did attempt to reach out to him before he passed. Is that correct?
Yeah, but he pretty much, I felt he didn't want to talk about that part of his life. Which I understand. But, it sounded like he lived a long, full life, and he stayed in the ministry and still performed music. Just not edgy rock and roll, like he said. But so, yeah, I would have loved to have met him.
My husband about this last night, where I was telling him in preparation for the interview. Now, I was familiar with the band Big Star before I took this tour, but I had no idea how huge their legacy in Memphis was until doing the tour. Tell us a little bit about them.
Oh my gosh. In 1967, some Midtown Memphis kids mostly went to a private boys' school here, except for Alex Chilton. He went to the local Midtown public school called Central High. But he wrote a song called The Letter back then, and their band, the Box Tops, all of a sudden had a #1 hit. And again, these, like Mylon and Elvis, these were teenagers. They got thrown onto the world stage with that song, The Letter, Send Me a Ticket on an Airplane. I'm sure most people have heard it. They did world tours, but essentially my understanding is that they saw a really ugly end of the business, the music industry, early on, and kind of soured some of them, and especially Alex Chilton. He was a rebel from then on out, basically. He ended up, the box tops, again, burned up pretty quickly. But there's a great new Alex Chilton documentary that's just about to come out by filmmaker, Memphis guy, David Leonard, who basically saved in the 1990s. But he's a filmmaker living in France now. But that's about to come out. But there's also another brilliant documentary about Big Star. Their story is just crazy. They had this amazing music that just happened to, timing wise, fall into the downfall of Stax in Memphis in the mid 70s. Oh. All great Rolling Stone 5 stars, like all this great kind of press for their first 2 records. People loved it, but you couldn't buy it anywhere. This distribution, all these crazy things. You got to watch the documentary that happened just right at once. And so they didn't make it on the scale which they should have. One of the things that was a negative, which I don't see how this could be a negative, but they were quote unquote too much like the Beatles, one major critic said. So I don't see a problem with that. But anyway, for Midtown kids from Memphis, Tennessee, sounding like the Beatles, I think is way cool. Anyway, anybody sounding like the Beatles is a feat in my eyes, but they kind of crushed and burned just like Mylon. And of course, because they basically started genre themselves, just like Mylon and just like Elvis. In other words, the genre today we call power pop, which is bands like The Replacements and REM, Matthew Sweet, people like that. There's a bunch of them. The Lemonheads of the power pop genre. Well, Big Star started that right there and played at the Shell in '74. So yeah, if you get a chance, read, listen, and watch anything about Big Star because it is fascinating. It's crazy, and it's a Memphis thing. It's really just sort of this crazy Memphis story that reads like a novel.
That might be my next rabbit hole after Mylon. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And can you go ahead for people who might see this and want to reach out to you?
Sure. My name's Cole Early, and again, I'm the content and archive manager at the Overton Park Shell in Midtown Memphis, Tennessee. Okay. My email address is cole@overtonparkshell.org. And again, you can sign up for the tour for the Backstage History experience at www.overtonparkshell.org/tours.
Thank you so much. And again, anybody who's watching this, who's interested, I highly encourage you to check this tour out. And I hope a lot of people check it out in August. I think if you're there for Elvis Week and you're looking for maybe some unique off the beaten track, things you haven't done yet, this is a great opportunity to get some Elvis, Memphis, and music history.
It doesn't have to end here. Click on one of the videos below for Elvis and more. And we'd love to have you like, share, and subscribe, and maybe even join so we can put some more gas in this thing.